Verith had not slept in 4 days. She lay curled in the back of the cave, her great body wrapped around her young drake like a wall against the cold. Soren was small, smaller than a drake his age should ever be. His scales, which should have been deep and rich like polished stone, had gone pale and dull. They barely caught the light anymore. His breathing came in slow, thin pulls, like he was working hard just to stay in the world. She watched his small chest rise. Then fall. Then rise again after a pause that was too long. She counted those pauses now. She had started counting them 3 nights ago. During the day, she brought him food, fresh river fish, soft cave moss soaked in warm water, everything the elder healers had told her to try. Soren would look at it. Sometimes he would lean toward it. But he could not eat. Whatever she put near him, his body refused. He would turn his head away and close his eyes again, and Verith would sit there holding the food and not knowing what to do with her hands. She had gone to the elder healers 6 days ago. Old Dravis had come with 2 others. They had walked around Soren slowly, studied him from every angle, pressed their clawed fingers along his belly and neck, and looked into his dull eyes. Then they had stepped aside and spoken in low voices. Verith had watched their faces. She had seen the answer before they gave it. Dravis had turned to her and said it plainly. Soren was a fading soul. It happened sometimes. A hatchling arrived in the world but could not hold on to it. The fire inside him was going out and there was nothing to be done. She should prepare herself. She should say her goodbyes while he could still hear her voice. Verith had not said a word. She had walked back to Soren, laid down beside him, and put her chin over his small body. She did not say goodbye. The clan left her alone after that. They understood grief. They gave her space and did not push. A few of the younger dragons looked at her with soft eyes when she passed. She did not look back. Days went by. Soren did not get better. But he did not go either. He stayed right there on the edge, thin and pale and still breathing, and Verith stayed right beside him. On the 4th night she heard something. One of the small forest creatures. A brown rabbit that sometimes sheltered in the outer caves during heavy rain, had crept in close to the warmth. Verith normally would not have noticed. But that night she was awake and she watched the small creature without moving. And the rabbit, perhaps feeling too tired to run, sat still and looked back at her. She did not know why she spoke to it. Maybe because she had not spoken to anyone in days. She asked if it knew of any healer in the valley below. The rabbit was quiet for a long moment. Then it said there was a human. A man who lived at the edge of the frontier near the tree line. It said the man had healed a fox with a broken leg the previous winter. It said the forest creatures went to him sometimes when the pain was too bad to carry. It said he never turned anyone away. Verith looked at Soren. She had never gone to a human for anything. No dragon did. It was not something that was done. Humans were small and loud and they did not understand the old ways. Asking one for help would be a thing the clan would talk about for a long time, and not kindly. She looked at Soren again. His chest rose. Paused. Fell. She counted the pause. It was the longest one yet. She stood up slowly, careful not to wake him. She gathered him against her chest with both arms, tucking his pale head under her chin. He weighed almost nothing. That was the part that frightened her most. How little he weighed now. A drake his age should be heavy and loud and difficult to carry. Soren was neither. She stepped out of the cave into the cold night air. The valley below was dark and quiet. Far down through the trees, a single small light burned in a window. She looked at it for a moment. Then she opened her wings and dropped silently off the ridge, falling toward that small, steady light with her son held close against her heart. Glen Ward woke up at the sound of something heavy landing outside. It was not the sound of a horse. It was not the sound of a cart or a falling tree or anything he had heard before in the 3 years he had lived at the edge of the frontier. It was a deep, heavy thud that came up through the floor and into his bones. His eyes opened and he lay still for 1 second, listening. Then came the knock. It was not a loud knock. That was the strange part. Whatever was outside did not pound or scratch or claw at the door. It knocked the way a person would, 3 slow, careful taps. Almost polite. Like whatever was out there understood that it was early and that people were sleeping and that it did not want to cause more trouble than it already was. Glen sat up. He was 51 years old and his back told him so every morning, but he moved without wasting time. He had spent 12 years as a field medic in the frontier wars. He had been woken before dawn by bad news more times than he could count. His body knew how to move before his mind caught up. He pulled on his coat and his boots and picked up the small lamp from beside his bed. He walked to the door and opened it. He had expected many things. He had not expected this. The dragon filled the space in front of his clinic completely. She was enormous, dark-scaled, broad-shouldered, her wings folded tight against her back. Her head was low, nearly level with his own, and her eyes were fixed on him with an expression he had never seen on any creature before. Not anger. Not threat. Something much harder to look at than either of those things. She was frightened. In her arms, held carefully against her chest, was a small drake. He was pale and limp, his head hanging slightly, his tail draped over her forearm like it had no strength left in it. His scales had almost no color. Glen looked at the hatchling. Then he looked at the mother. She opened her mouth. What came out was slow and careful, each word clearly hard to find. She said, "Please. Help." That was all. Glen stood in his doorway with his lamp in his hand and looked at this massive dragon mother crouched low in the dark, holding out her sick child and asking him in 2 broken words for something she had probably never asked anyone for in her life. He did not step back. He did not reach for anything behind the door. He looked at the small drake again, the pale scales, the shallow breathing he could see even from where he stood, the way the little body lay without resistance in the mother's arms. He pulled the door open wider and stepped to the side. He said, "Bring him in. Watch your head." Verith stared at him. Just for a moment. Like she had prepared herself for something else entirely and his response had not matched anything she had expected. Then she moved, carefully, folding herself through the doorway with a patience and quietness that surprised him. She was too large for the room. Her tail curved along the back wall and her head nearly touched the ceiling. She stood very still and looked at him with those wide, careful eyes. Glen had already moved to his work table. He cleared it with one arm, set down his lamp, and turned around with his hands open. He said, "Lay him here." Gently. She laid Soren down on the table like she was setting down something made of glass. Her claws pulled back slowly. She did not step away. She stayed right beside the table with her eyes on Glen's hands and her breathing slow and controlled, the way a person breathes when they are working very hard to stay calm. Glen leaned over the hatchling. He checked the eyes first, dull, slow to respond. He pressed 2 fingers lightly along the belly, tight, swollen slightly on one side. He checked the color of the gums and the inside of the mouth. He listened to the breathing with his ear close without touching. Then he stood up straight and looked at Verith. He asked her, when did he last eat anything that stayed down? Verith blinked. It was clearly not the question she had expected either. She thought about it and answered him honestly. Glen nodded slowly, pulled his stool close to the table, and sat down. He said, "All right. Tell me everything. Start from the beginning." Glen did not rush. That was the first thing Verith noticed about him. Every healer she had ever seen move around a sick creature did so with a kind of urgency that made her feel worse: quick hands, sharp eyes, tight mouths. It always felt like they were racing something. Like they already knew they were losing and were trying not to show it. Glen moved like he had all the time in the world. He pulled his stool close to the table and sat beside Soren with a small lamp positioned just above the hatchling's belly. He pressed his fingers along the sides slowly, working from the chest downward, feeling carefully at each spot before moving to the next. Sometimes he stopped and pressed a little deeper. Sometimes he tilted his head like he was listening to something only he could hear. He asked Verith questions while he worked. He asked what Soren normally ate. She told him. He asked at what age he had started refusing food. She told him that too. He asked if there had been any change in behavior before the refusing started, any unusual stillness, any sign of discomfort after eating. Verith thought hard and then told him yes. About a month before Soren stopped eating completely, he had begun sitting very still after meals. She had thought he was simply tired. Glen nodded and wrote something down on a small piece of paper. He asked if Soren had ever swallowed anything he should not have: a stone, a piece of bone, anything hard and solid that was not food. Verith opened her mouth and then closed it again. She thought about 3 months ago when Soren had been playing near the cave entrance and had put a dark river stone in his mouth. She had told him to drop it. She had assumed he did. She told Glen about the stone. Glen looked up at her for just a moment. Not with blame. Not with any expression that made her feel foolish. He simply nodded and looked back down at Soren and pressed his fingers a little more carefully along the lower belly. After a moment he found it. He did not say anything dramatic. He simply stopped moving his fingers, kept them pressed gently in one spot just below the middle of the belly, and was still for a few seconds. Then he let out a slow breath through his nose. He told Verith plainly and without softening it that Soren was not cursed and his inner fire was not going out. He had a blockage deep in his gut. Something solid, possibly that stone, had been sitting in there for weeks, slowly getting worse. Because of it, nothing Soren ate could move through properly. His body was not absorbing any of it. He was starving not because he would not eat but because his body had no way to use what little he managed to swallow. Verith stared at him. She asked. Quietly, carefully, if he was certain. Glen said yes. She asked if Soren could be helped. Glen said he believed so. He said he would not promise what he could not deliver, but he had treated blockages before in people and in animals, and what he was feeling was not beyond reaching. He said they needed to work through the night and that she needed to stay calm and let him focus. Verith straightened up and said nothing more. Glen got to work. He heated water on the small stove in the corner of the clinic and prepared a warm herbal solution that he had used before to relax the muscles of the gut and encourage movement. He explained to Verith what each thing was as he prepared it, not because she asked, but because he seemed to understand that a mother watching someone work on her child needed to know what was happening at every step. He gave Soren the solution in very small amounts, carefully, using a soft cloth to ease it past the hatchling's lips. He worked slowly and did not force anything. Between each small administration he waited and watched, his fingers resting lightly on Soren's belly, feeling for any change. Around the middle of the night Soren made a small sound. It was barely anything, a low, weak noise from somewhere deep in his chest. But it was the first sound he had made in days and Veritha's head came up sharply. Glen said, "That is a good sign. Keep steady." She kept steady. She watched Glen's calm hands and his focused eyes and the careful way he moved, and she stayed still and let him work. The lamp burned low. Glen replaced it without looking away from Soren. Outside the window, the sky began to change, going from black to deep blue at the edges. Glen kept working. And slowly, very slowly, the tiny body on the table began to look a little less still. The sun was just beginning to show at the edge of the mountains when the sound of heavy wings filled the valley. Glen heard it first. He looked up from the table and toward the window without stopping what he was doing. 3 large shapes dropped out of the pale morning sky and landed in the open ground just beyond the tree line. The impact of each landing sent a small shudder through the clinic floor. Verith heard it too. Her head turned toward the window and something in her face changed. Not fear, but a tightening. Like she had been expecting this and was not looking forward to it. Glen looked at her and then looked back at Soren and kept working. Elder Dravis was the first to approach the clinic. He was old, older than Verith by many decades, and he moved with the slow, heavy certainty of a creature that had never been told no by anything in the world. His scales were deep gray and weathered. His eyes were sharp and cold. Behind him came 2 younger warriors, broad and silent, their eyes scanning the valley the way soldiers scan unfamiliar ground. Dravis stopped outside the clinic window. He looked in. He saw Verith standing beside a small wooden table inside a human building. He saw a tiny human man in a worn coat bent over her hatchling with his bare hands. He stood very still for a moment and looked at this scene with an expression that moved slowly from surprise to something harder. He spoke through the window in the dragon tongue, loud enough that his voice came clearly through the glass. He told Verith that she had been gone since before midnight. He told her the clan had sent him to bring her home. He told her that what she was doing, standing inside a human's den, allowing a human to put his hands on her child, was beneath her and beneath the name she carried. He told her to gather Soren and come home now, where proper care and proper grieving could happen among her own people. It was small. Just his head, turning very slightly toward the warmth of the food. His nostrils opened. His eyes, those pale dull eyes that had been barely tracking anything for days, opened slowly and focused. They focused on Glen's face. Glen stayed completely still and kept the food where it was and said softly, "There you are." Soren opened his mouth. Glen eased the preparation in, just a small amount. And Soren swallowed. He did not turn away. He did not reject it. He swallowed and his eyes stayed open, and after a moment his small tongue came out and he swallowed again. Verith made a sound she could not hold back. It was not a word. It was something that came from deeper than words. Outside the window Dravis had gone completely still. The 2 warriors beside him had gone still too. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. One of the warriors, the younger one who had looked uncomfortable before, looked away from the window and stared at the ground, his jaw tight, his eyes bright. Dravis looked at Soren. He looked at the human in the worn coat who had not asked for praise or acknowledgement and was already reaching for a clean cloth to wipe the hatchling's mouth gently. The elder said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The morning came in quietly. Light moved through the clinic window in long pale strips and settled across the floor and the table and the small sleeping shape of Soren. Glen had pulled a stool close and dozed in it for a few hours with his chin on his chest and his coat still on. Verith had not slept at all. She had stood beside the table the entire night, watching her son breathe, counting nothing now because there was nothing left to count. The pauses were gone. The breathing was steady and even and calm. She watched his scales in the growing light. They were changing. She had noticed it first in the dark hours before dawn, a very slight deepening in the color along his neck and shoulders. By the time full morning came through the window it was unmistakable. The pale washed-out gray was pulling back like fog lifting off water, and underneath it the real color was returning. Deep and rich and dark, the way it had been when he first hatched and she had held him for the first time and thought she had never seen anything so perfect in her life. Glen woke up when Soren moved. It was not a dramatic thing. Soren simply shifted on the table, pulled his front legs under himself slowly, and pushed himself upright. He sat there on his own 4 legs and blinked at the room around him. His eyes were clear. Bright. They moved around the clinic with the slow curious attention of a young creature seeing the world properly for the first time in weeks. He looked at Glen. Glen looked back at him and said, "Good morning." Soren tilted his head slightly at the sound of the human voice. Then he looked at Verith. And Verith, who had held herself together through 4 days of fear and one very long night, put her great head down close to her son and made a low sound that had no name in any language but that every living creature understood. Soren pressed his nose against her jaw. Glen stood up from his stool, stretched his back with a quiet groan, and went to the stove to heat water. He did not make a moment of what had just happened. He simply moved on to the next thing, the way he always did, the way he had always done through 12 years of field work and 3 years of frontier medicine, one thing at a time, no drama, just the next step. When the water was ready he came back to the table and showed Verith what to do. He had written it down on a piece of paper in large simple letters, and he read each point aloud as he explained it. Small meals only for the next 2 weeks, nothing large, nothing that would put pressure on a gut still recovering. Warm water with each feeding, not cold. Rest, as much as Soren would allow. No flying for at least 10 days. If the color began to fade again or the breathing changed, she was to come back immediately, day or night. Verith listened to every word. She did not interrupt. She looked at the paper and at Glen's face and at his hands as he demonstrated the feeding method with the same careful patience he had used all night. When he finished she asked him what she owed him. Glen folded the piece of paper and held it out to her. He said she owed him nothing. He said Soren owed him nothing either. He said the only payment he ever needed was that the patient got better, and Soren had done that part himself. Verith took the paper from his hand very gently with 2 fingers. She stood straight. She looked at this small quiet human in his worn coat and his tired eyes who had opened his door before dawn without hesitation, who had worked through an entire night without complaint, who had asked for nothing and given everything, and who was now standing in his own clinic acting as if none of it had been a remarkable thing at all. She lowered her head. Not a small nod. Not a polite dip. She lowered her great head all the way down, her chin nearly touching the floor of the clinic, her eyes closing. It was the deepest bow in dragon tradition. It was given only in moments of profound respect. It had never in the long history of her clan been given to a human being. She held it. Outside the clinic Dravis had been standing since dawn. He had not left. He had watched through the window as the hatchling sat up on his own. He had watched the color come back into those small scales. He had watched the human show the mother how to care for her son with the patience of someone who simply believed that was what you did for a creature in need. He stepped forward now. He lowered his great gray head slowly. All the way down. The 2 warriors on either side of him looked at each other and then did the same without a word. Glen stood in the middle of his small clinic surrounded by 4 bowing dragons and had absolutely no idea what to do with his hands. He looked at them all and then looked at Soren, who was watching him with bright curious eyes. Glen put the kettle on. It was the only thing that made sense to him. He put the kettle on and sat down and let the morning come in through the window, quiet and ordinary and exactly like every other morning, except that it was nothing like any morning that had ever come before.